I grew up in a time and in places where it was pretty common as you would drive down these country roads and go past a country store that folks would be gathered, men would be gathered out on the front porch. And typically they were there would be maybe a few chairs, but more often there would be a bench up against the wall, usually under a window. And those that needed to sit would sit there or sit in the chairs. And those who were able would come around and they would squat down. And you often in a semicircle or a circle. And we called that squatting hunkering. Folks would hunker down. And I always knew that where people hunkered, people told stories. So that's the image that's attached to hunkering for me, is this thing of telling stories. Now, the same sort of thing happened in family reunions. You would go to the family reunion and the men would gather often outside in a circle with some chairs and some hunkering, and they would tell stories. And women would be inside in a circle in chairs, and I don't know what they did because I didn't go there. Men had ideas about what they were doing, but I suspect they were doing the same thing that the men were doing outside. What's interesting to me are the stories that you and I tell about ourselves. Now, when people would gather like that, they would often start out telling stories about each other, about the other people in the circle, or about someone who wasn't there. But once it warmed up, once they got a little closer to each other and the walls came down a bit, people would tell stories about themselves. And oh, those were good. Those were good. You always knew that the others were somewhat true, but the ones that they told had more of an element of truth to them. Over the years, I have come to recognize that you and I choose consciously or unconsciously the stories we tell about ourselves. We do not tell every story about ourselves. There are two groups that we don't tell. There's the group of those we don't remember. How can we tell them? And then there's that group of stories that we're not going to tell. You know what those stories are, don't you? So we choose to tell the stories that convey to others our sense of who we are and who we want them to think we are. So there's this whole elaborate presentation of stories that you and I have. Well, that happens not just in our daily lives, it happens in the Bible too. In our gospel reading for today, John tells this rather well-known story of Jesus in the temple. But if, as we read it this morning, it felt a little tepid as opposed to how you've heard it before or seen it acted out somewhere, it's because it is. The same story appears in the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but it appears right before Jesus is arrested. And it's a much stronger, more radical kind of presentation of Jesus. And it, in fact, is part of the reason that Jesus is arrested before he's tried and crucified. But in John tells the story in a kinder, gentler, Jesus kind of way. And he tells it early in Jesus' ministry as if what he wants to say to us is that it's not about Jesus really shaking things up, but Jesus is the new temple. He replaces the old temple. But they tell the story, they choose the story of Jesus to tell, and they chose the stories 30 or 40 years after he died. They didn't tell every story about Jesus. They told the ones that they wanted us to hear so that we would know something about him. You and I do that about ourselves and about each other, but we also choose other things as favorites to represent who we are. One is rules and laws. Now, I'm sure someone is going to want to stand up and say, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I oppose every law. I stand up for every law. Don't stand up and do that. We know you're lying. I don't uphold every law. I'm not going to tell you which ones I break, because this is going out on the internet. But we don't. We choose which laws we obey and which ones are our laws. Take the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments that we read this morning. I truly would hope that we can come to a mutual agreement that we try to uphold the one about not committing murder.
Right.
You okay with that?
Yep.
That's a good place to start. But let me ask you this. Have you ever picked up a catalog or looked on the internet or walked through a store and said, I want that? You know, my neighbor down the street or my cousin or my brother, they have one of those, and I've always really wanted one of those. How are you doing with coveting? I would hope that we could come to a mutual agreement on that one about stealing. At least, I don't want anybody to steal my stuff. I'm not going to ask you about adultery. We're just going to let that one stay out there. But let me ask you this one. How are you doing with the one about Sabbath? It's not one of the ones I've adopted. You see, we choose which laws and which rules we obey, which ones we claim, and the ones we claim and the ones we don't claim, they say something about us. You like to squeeze through those red lights? Or maybe you don't stop at that stop sign because no one's coming. Are you a First Amendment or a Second Amendment person? Because apparently we can't do both. And if not those, which one is yours? You see, our choices in these matters, they say something about ourselves, how we see ourselves, and how we want to be seen by others. My friends, Lent is our hunkering down time. Lent is our time when we gather in this circle and we tell our stories. And we tell them to each other, and we tell them to God. And we tell the ones, at least to God, that we don't want to tell, and we may not ever tell to anyone else. Because as we tell our stories, and as we claim those other stories that come up that we may have forgotten or someone else brings up because we didn't want to remember them, and as we do that, something incredible happens in our lives. We are transformed. Claimed by God and transformed. There's this there's this tradition in some other Christian denominations and churches. We don't do it much in the Episcopal Church, although sometimes we do. And it's called doing testimonies or witnessing. And it's where people stand up and they typically say, for many years I was this way, and then I encountered Christ, and since then I've been this way. And I think they're wonderful stories. They're very interesting and fascinating and moving accounts of the ways in which our lives are transformed by God as we open ourselves to God in Christ. But they're limited. And here's the limitation that I think they have. And that is, they often are presented with the assumption that transformation is a one-time event. And I just can't buy it. I've got too many stories that I carry in my life. I've got too much need to open myself more fully to God's presence. I've got too much left there that God needs to help transform for me to see that as a final event. And every time we tell these stories and every time we open ourselves to God in Christ, we are transformed. So hunker down. But there's one other element to this. If we are continually transformed, then maybe we have a say in how our lives change from this point forward. Wouldn't that be great? Maybe as you and I open ourselves to God, we see the stories we would like for other people to tell about us. Maybe even after we're gone. What stories would you want them to tell about you from this time forward that talk about the ways in which your life has changed, the ways in which God has been present and manifested in you in community? What are those stories? Those are the ones you need to open to God and to others too. We all do. And even as we do, we open ourselves not just to this possibility, but to the reality of God's transforming love in us and in the world. So hunker down. Tell your stories. And let God transform you. Amen.